Thanks for joining us. I am Ron Brownstein, editorial director at The Atlantic Media, which is the co-sponsor of the Ideas Festival, and we're happy to be here. And we have a, I think, fascinating conversation for you tonight about the science of prediction and two excellent guides through this very complex area. Mark Penn, to my left, is the corporate vice president for strategic and special project at Microsoft. Previously, he was the worldwide CEO of Burson Marsteller and has served, of course, as a senior advisor to Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, and Tony Blair. Nate Silver, on my right. You can applaud. It's fine. Nate Silver created the 538.com blog in 2008, drove that to enormous prominence, and now continues to publish it under the big umbrella of the New York Times. He is the author of the recent book, The Signal and the Noise, which I believe will be available outside when we are done. Could be, and he might even be persuaded to sign a few. Let's start by, I want to talk about kind of the broad questions about our ability to predict and forecast what's coming, and then in the second half talk a little bit more about specifically about what this means for the political world. But Nate, let me start with you, because a lot of people identify you with the idea that with enough data and a good enough algorithm, you can predict anything, from the results of a presidential election to how many championships LeBron is going to win, each of which I think you have predicted in recent weeks. But yet the subtitle of your book is Why So Many Predictions Fail, but Some Don't. So broadly speaking, how much ability, even in this era of big data, do we have to see around the corner?
Well, I think broadly speaking, we still kind of suck at prediction, is the headline. And ironically, I think elections, especially general elections, are one of the things that are more predictable than people realize. By the time you get to after Labor Day, October of an election year, people are pretty darn locked in. About 90% of the country is going to vote based on the party labels anyway, 5% based on the economy. So you have a very, very small group of actual swing voters now, and that makes things pretty predictable. Also, the same states since 2000 or so, Bill Clinton had a somewhat different map. But since Gore, the last 4 elections have featured more or less the same map where one candidate might do a little better overall, but the states are in the same order. But broadly speaking, I mean, you haven't seen, in fields ranging from medicine, where there have been a lot of progress, but also a ton of false positive results in literature, to earthquakes, where we have no more ability now to really detect an earthquake in advance than we did a millennium ago, really. Look at the global economy. I think one of the issues is that when we get more data, it also allows people to cherry pick the facts they want to see in ways that make their predictions worse, really. Back in the day when we only had one poll or a couple of polls, and the poll might be right or it might be wrong, but you didn't have as much to disagree about. And now you can, if you want, cherry pick 5 from among 50 polls and start to tell a story that isn't very accurate.
So let me ask you, if you're going to think in your mind of a continuum from what we can predict best to what we can predict least, you've mentioned some of the things that are at the bottom, earthquakes. What else? I mean, kind of give me your sense of what that continuum looks like. What are we best at predicting now, and what is still most opaque to us?
So, I mean, I think one of the counter-arguments, kind of my thesis, I guess, is that there are some things we take for granted now that would have been thought of as being very hard to predict many years ago. So astronomy now, I went to a panel today talking about asteroid impacts and how you can now, even for relatively small asteroids, detect years in advance whether they might threaten the Earth. That's a pretty useful thing, I would say. It used to be, though, back in the 18th century, that we couldn't even predict the orbits of Jupiter and Saturn. It was thought they might run into one another eventually.
Which would have been really bad, right?
That would have been also really bad. Yeah, we wouldn't be here today, I don't think. So, on the other end of the spectrum, I think complex systems, I think the economy is something where there's been almost no improvement in economic prediction whatsoever, that there's still basically forecasting whether there'll be a recession more than 6 months in advance. You can't do any better than random. The baseline rate's about 20%. That's the best guess usually, because it's just the economy changes and evolves too quickly to really permit much more precision than that.
Mark, you've seen this from both the business side and the campaign side. What is easier to predict, political behavior or consumer behavior?
Well, actually, they're both very difficult to predict. What's interesting about consumer behavior is that, you kind of get a bite of the apple every day, right? And so You can predict it tomorrow, next Wednesday.
Preferably not always the apple. just
as long as you get a bite.
Yeah, okay. All right.
But you can really, of course, you can't repeat the holiday season. Movies are where we put a lot of prediction effort into is actually the movies, where movies are very much like a political campaign. You have an opening weekend, and that opening weekend will really determine the fate, and you can't repeat that. And we've actually gotten quite good. Part of what we did was we transferred a lot of the political techniques, which are really been most advanced. Now, what's also interesting about political predictions is you can be wrong the entire day, the entire year, as long as you're right the night before, and you get up till about midnight to predict it absolutely correctly, and everything else is explained by changes. But when you think about all of the time and effort that goes into those single predictions, it tells you how difficult the prediction business is. I always go back to a speech, and I would always give this example that Lyndon Johnson gave a speech that I'm creating the Department of Housing and Urban Development because social scientists say that 95% of us will live in cities. And of course, 95% of us didn't live in cities. And had he known that, he wouldn't have created the department. But most long-term predictions, whether it's political, social, or whether or not we're going to have cell phones, are usually not right.
So let me ask you, when have you seen in campaigns and in government, to what extent do people try to forecast and then make contingency plans for what they think is going to happen? When have you seen that work, and when have you seen it kind of crash and burn?
Well, I think that, remember that a lot of political prediction is based on voters not really having full knowledge, and what will the voters be like when they've heard both sides of the argument. So one of the most interesting prediction war games I ever participated in was before the Republicans shut down the government in late 1995. We had war gamed, what would the arguments be? So you take a public that's never had a government shutdown, you give it a situation that's never happened before, and you run everybody through all the arguments. And we concluded, and we told the president, we said, if the Republicans shut down the government, it will redound to our benefit, and it will isolate the Republicans. And so then they did that, and then it looked like complete chaos. And then the president turned to me and said, sure, this is right. Because that's the other thing about predictions. You have to, if you're going to rely on them, whether it's an investment prediction, a political prediction like that, you're going to have to see it through. And that's oftentimes hard.
Your point about the economy, I went back this morning in preparation for this and found the first Obama budget. When he came into office. And it projected that by now the economy would be growing at 4.2% and unemployment would be 5.2%. So, obviously it's not quite there. How would you kind of assess, is our ability to forecast getting better, not really changing?
There's another kind of implicit question that you might be skipping over in there, which is that if the White House puts out a set of economic projections, whether it's the Obama White House or the Bush White House, it's a political document. It's not a document with the goal of being accurate. And although economic predictions in general are pretty bad, if you go back and look at the White House's forecast, going back in time, both Democrats and Republicans, that's the worst of all predictors over time, right? So a lot of this is, you have to, it's difficult to be unbiased. I think the media's definition of what bias means is flawed in a lot of ways, but prediction is difficult. And if your incentive is to spin people instead of be accurate, then your predictions are probably going to be something to bet against instead of to bet upon.
So what have we're talking about some of the changes we have seen in public opinion, say in the past 10 and 20 years. What has most surprised you about where we are in terms of ideas that are now majority opinion in the public? What's most surprised you?
Well, look, I think you've seen the tremendous growth of social tolerance, and I think you saw it reflected in the Supreme Court ruling. I mean, you go back from the signing of the Defense of Marriage Act in 1996 to today, I think this dramatic movement in public opinion on tolerance and attitudes towards gay marriage. I mean, that's a dramatic social indicator that changed. And let me just also say one thing about the prediction businesses. What I kind of determined a long time ago is that one of the big reasons that we are wrong in our predictions is that we don't understand enough about the present before we try to predict the future. And that if we understood more how societies compose today, how young people's attitudes have changed, why they've changed, that you're going to actually be a lot better in your predicting or your models.
Because now your book, Microtrends, a few years ago, I mean, you basically argue that it's a mistake to look for big systemic waves, that really the change is more kind of pointillist, you know? I mean, just many small changes in the society kind of adding up to a different direction. Do you still feel that way, and why?
Well, absolutely. I mean, look, again, microtrends didn't deny that there weren't megatrends or macrotrends occurring, but it said, look, under the surface now, the power of a few percent of the people who are determined, in fact, even 1%, right, to make a hit movie. If 1% will buy Nate's book, he will be more than happy. You know, that the power of 1%, and you're seeing this now around the world. In fact, if you look at the protest movements in different countries, 2 or 3% can stimulate millions of people who can change the world. And that was the point of microtrends. Don't just look for, well, everybody's going to have a cell phone. Look much deeper at the pointillist painting to see what's really going on in society.
You know, I'm interested in, when you look at the kind of change, for example, we've seen on attitudes toward gay marriage and other areas, and Pew, I think, tried to address this in a poll a couple months ago. I mean, to what extent are we seeing, you know, older people changing their mind? And to what extent is it, as Mark, I think, was suggesting, a kind of generational change that more young people are reaching adulthood, crossing the 18-year-old threshold and getting counted, their opinion, and kind of shaping what our overall views are? And if it is the latter, can we project forward about what else might change as more millennials enter the adult pool?
I think well, first of all, to answer the question, it's about half and half if you kind of map it out, that based on, I call it kind of the Reader's Digest problem, where Reader's Digest subscriptions have dropped over the years. Not that many people unsubscribe from Reader's Digest, but you know they pass on eventually. The average Reader's Digest subscriber is like 72 years old, and you're going to have some turnover as a result. But you also have people changing their minds, particularly when people encounter gay people in their families or among their friends or in their workplaces. You know, I should say on this issue, which is unique in some respects for how State of the Movement has been, you know, I think the arguments against gay marriage are just not very persuasive, right? So I do think the substance matters to some extent, and you see differences on that issue from abortion, which is, you know, kind of the question of when does life begin? That's a more difficult, I think, question to address. And then if it's ambiguous, kind of where do you err on the side of giving people more leeway or protecting the unborn if you're from the other point of view, right? So that's a trickier issue where on gay marriage there's not really a lot there. The argument's very flimsy against it. You can make a conservative case, as Andrew Sullivan and people have been doing for a long time, for gay marriage. But that issue is unique. You don't see such steady and persistent movement on very many things at all.
Well, let me ask you, before we go, I want to go to a couple of more broadly about policy, but let's stick with this for 1 second. Given the changes that we're seeing in public opinion and kind of the growth in support for gay marriage, certainly we're seeing rapid movement in blue states. Right, and we're up to, like, you know, by the 18 states that have voted Democratic in at least the past 6 elections, what I once called the blue wall, we could be at 14 of the 18 having gay marriage by 2014, certainly by 2016. On the other hand, you know, we have 29 red states that have banned it in their constitution. So how does this work? If the Supreme Court does not establish a nationwide right, even if public opinion rises, does it eventually get over the top of the levee in those red states, or are we just basically going to run the experiment we didn't run under Roe, which is 2 sets of rules for the country for a sustained period? What do you think?
I mean, I guess, you know, from my point of view, you can model it pretty consistently, and it's pretty steady across different states. You know, for example, this past year we had Minnesota, which is certainly a blue-leaning state, but kind of closer to the median of the electorate, fairly purple, where voters there approved gay marriage, right? So it's been somewhat predictable at the state level, I suppose. I remember in 2009 you had a ballot initiative in Maine, and we had a model that was pretty simple, just based on how other states had voted in the past, and you know, our conclusion was there was about a 70% chance, I think, that Maine would vote to uphold gay marriage, and they didn't. right? But some people said, well, this proves that at the ballot booth it's not going to do anything. But then just 3 years later, you have Maine affirming gay marriage and states like Minnesota, which are closer to the purple side, doing so as well.
What do you think, Mark? Do you think this will reach red states
Well,
without a national decision?
Without a national decision, I think it's going to be difficult for it to reach every state, but I do agree that it's going to reach a tremendous number of states. And look, there's 75% plus among the younger generation that just sees marriage fundamentally differently. But don't also forget that the older generation now, if you look at the numbers, went through 2 or 3 generations of divorce. Right? I sometimes say that the older folks now, more of them are cohabiting than ever before, right? And the older generation now is living in the sin that when their kids were growing up, they condemned their kids for, and then they got divorced, and then they didn't get remarried, and then live in what they used to call sin. And so their attitudes fundamentally to being more tolerant have also changed because their own lives have changed.
I think many people in this room, by which I really mean me, are most interested in what all of these developments mean for politics and the political competition between the parties. So let me start with a couple of kind of process questions and then get to kind of like your views of kind of the substantive state of play, the balance of power between the two sides. What are the biggest challenges? I mean, we had an incredible, as a journalist, kind of taking the incoming, and you certainly were as well, an incredible proliferation of polls, more than ever before. Sometimes in October it felt like 20 or 25 at 30 a day, and having varying quality and varying results. What are the biggest challenges you think facing both public and the private campaign pollsters at this time? Mark, why don't you start?
Well, there are innumerable challenges. First, you start out with how you're going to poll people, right? When I started, people only relied on door-to-door, and we really made the first transition to phone polls. And everybody said, oh my God, you can't poll people by the telephone, there aren't enough. Now, when 25% and growing, maybe it's 30% from the time we started this panel, of households don't have a phone line, and that is dramatically. So then people have both cell phones and internet. So the question is, at what point will internet polling be more reliable than phone polling? It hasn't happened yet. So how just to start off, all of these problems with predictions, and then obviously turnout now is a variable that can't be predicted just based on history. You used to look there, you looked back at history, you said maybe there's a 2 or 3% change, you had a turnout model. We've seen with the tremendous financial power of the campaigns that they can either win by getting swing voters across the line or by adding a lot more voters who intensely support them to the voter pool. And either could be an outcome that is very difficult to predict.
Your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I would disagree. I think that internet polling was better than some types of phone polling last year. I think internet polling is better right now. It's not that close than a poll that's not going to call cell phones in addition to landlines. But yeah, it's tricky when only 10% of people now respond to even the best, even the Pew poll or the NBC Wall Street Journal poll, even the most expensive surveys, and maybe 3% to a robo-poll or something. One problem, we talked before about what, maybe it's hard to model turnout, but part of the issue also is that when you're getting only 10% of the electorate, the people who respond to the poll are going to be already highly motivated. So you've basically already conducted a de facto, usually likely voter screen, and so to further screen people out is probably overkill, right? And to have models calibrated in an era when half of people would respond to polls, to try and stick with the same likely voter model you had in Gallup's case in the 1950s or something is probably a little bit wacky.
Yeah, I felt like reading the Gallup poll in the fall, or I think I said to you before, I felt it was a syllogism. Because of their likely voter model, they were producing an electorate that was 78% white, which has not been true since 2000. I remember saying to people, I would say to people, I will posit for you that if the electorate is 78% white, Mitt Romney is probably going to win by 4 points. But what are the odds of that? Is that the hardest thing for pollsters to get right? Who turns out and what the composition of the electorate will look like?
Let me give you the widest variations, and they can be exactly the opposite. The widest variation I ever had was when Ed Koch ran for governor of New York, give you some older stories. Guy? And what?
Was it the 82?
Yes.
Against Mario Cuomo?
And The New York Post said he would win by 17 points. Our polls done to highly screened primary voters said he was going to lose. So by election day, we were in what I'd call a no-win scenario. We told him he was going to lose. If he won, he was going to be mad at us, and if he lost, he lost. And then he lost, despite the New York Post, and he said, your poll was right after all. But that 20-point spread is the largest that I've seen. I'd say the opposite was true in Iowa for Hillary. In Iowa for Hillary, to find the movement among young people, I had to do the opposite, disregard the old-fashioned lists, go to more randomized digital, even for a caucus, to find that there was a huge movement.
Well, I
on his
remember
behalf.
meeting with Teresa Vilmain, who was running the state for you in '08, and when she was saying, if it was 175,000 or less, we felt comfortable we were going to win, and it ended up being 230 or so, was it? Basically,
It was high 200s.
yeah, it was at least double what it had ever been before, and I think the Des Moines Register final poll had an inkling of that. I mean, she was saying it was going to be unprecedented. But again, I kind of wonder, is that the hardest thing for pollsters to get? Who votes and how many of them will be there?
Yeah, I mean, another tricky thing about that Iowa race, by the way, was that you basically had the peak period for polling coincided with the holiday season, right? And young people are more likely to move away from home for the holidays. But I think actually when, it's not the pollster's job to preordain a turnout model, right? You're supposed to have a good likely voter screen or whatever, which in this day and age might be actually a fairly lax one, and then kind of let the numbers speak for themselves. So you had a lot of Republican polls this past year that were garbage in, garbage out, or assumption in, assumption out, to be somewhat less pejorative, right? They're like, well, we are sure that Obama won't get the same turnout that he had in 2008, right? So if we put these assumptions in the poll, then Romney wins Pennsylvania, whatever, right? That's no longer a poll, right? That's someone's opinion, not justified with any empiricism. Yeah.
That's if the electorate is going to get 3 points more white, you're going to do better than if in fact it continues the long-term trajectory and is 2 points less white roughly every 4 years.
See, and that's why in those scenarios, what I wind up recommending and doing is polling both ways under both assumptions. If the polls come out the same, no problem. If there's a difference, then I start to worry.
Let me ask you guys a little bit about the way the campaigns are using information, because this certainly was, one of the things that, the heroes of this campaign are the analytics team, the Obama analytics team, which, we were kind of writing about and people are kind of fascinated with. And Karl Rove was here, yesterday, the day before, was talking about kind of the arms race between the parties to acquire information about individuals. How many pieces of information you can get about voters in Ohio and Colorado and Virginia and the other handful of states they can test. What do you think, other than party ID, like if someone is registered as a Republican or a Democrat, what do you think is the most useful thing to know about somebody from the point of view of a campaign to predict how they're going to vote?
Yeah, but it depends upon the specific campaign and what the issues are. Yeah, but even that will depend upon, is it a generational difference? So is it a campaign that's about generations? Is it a campaign that's about economics? Is it a campaign that's about social issues? That will tell you what the other variables. But your point is that we are approaching remember, what happened is there was all organizational politics. Then there was all mass media politics. Now we're back to a bitter stress on organization, but the first time we have the ability to actually micro-target individuals. Now, again, some of these articles look like, it was never done before.
Right.
These campaigns have been calling hundreds of thousands of people, scoring them for as long as, we started campaigns as there were telephones. So, but the ability now to do it on the basis of what sites people visit, what their habits are, to bring in other sources of data, that is a new ability that people never had before.
It feels like the campaigns are moving from dealing with the electorate as a beach to dealing with them as grains of sand, at least in these swing states. What do you think about, how much is this, I think you did study this. Was the behavior of voters in the states that were part of the campaign very different from demographically similar people in states that weren't part of the campaign?
I think not all that much. The question is, what can you do to get that extra 2%? In a presidential election campaign, then between turnout, right, and the campaign team's analytics, you might be getting an extra couple of percent, and that might have been enough for Obama to win, say, Florida in 2012 or North Carolina in 2008 when he wouldn't have otherwise. But really, I think there are issues with dividing people up too much. One big issue is that people are all subject to multiple demographic characteristics, right? So I could describe myself and say, well, I live in New York and I'm highly educated, right? And I'm gay, and so I have all these things that would predict me voting Democrat, but I have a high income, and I'm kind of a small business owner, basically, and I'm a white man, so that would predict me voting Republican, right? And which of those is most important at any given time, I think, is difficult. It's a multidimensional problem. But you also have the issue where last year, the most important issue, no matter where you lived, no matter what your demographic was, you were most likely to say that the economy was the most important issue. So I think there's sometimes people say, well, Hispanics, immigration, right? Or people, I think, just kind of simplify things into one issue categories when really, there's more even now that binds us together than which divides us, at least in terms of what priorities we think are important for the country.
Let me ask you about a kind of now we've been talking about kind of process and strategy. I want to ask you about kind of the state of play in the parties. And one thing that's been fascinating for me to watch has been this, you were talking about the assumption that Obama could not match his minority turnout in particular and his millennial turnout in particular in 2012. Immediately after the election, there was a big kind of burst in the Republican Party that said, hey, we've got a demographic problem. We have to kind of readjust trying to meet these voters where they are. Lately, particularly as the immigration bill has come more to a head, there's been a counter-argument emerging in the Republican Party that says, actually, we don't really have to do better among minorities. We can regain the White House by increasing white turnout and increasing our share of the white vote. Even though Mitt Romney won a larger percentage of white voters in 2012 than Ronald Reagan did in 1980, which is kind of a strike, and ran as well among whites as any Republican challenger ever, Eisenhower in 52 and Bush in 88. So I'm interested in your thought, Mark. Is there a strategy for the Republican Party going forward that does not require them to improve their performance among minorities? Can they regain the White House simply by driving the white margins up further?
Well, look, I think that would be a precarious strategy at best. I mean, every party at some point runs out of what was its constituency. Again, if you go back to '96, Democrats always looked for non-college white manufacturing guys, and everything was oriented towards that. And, they weren't making any more of those because manufacturing sector
And they were voting against you in large numbers
and
by
they
then.
were. So we went to soccer moms, and that defined a kind of a different generation of Democratic voter. The Republicans really, when you look at it, the Latino vote in particular has gone 96 from 2% to really breaking into double digits, and will continue to grow. So they know that if they're not really able to play in the Latino community, what's their future going to be? It's going to be very hard for them to win elections, and the counter strategy is, like I said, at best precarious in nature.
How would you rate that bet that they can recover in 2016 either by increasing, they talk about the missing white voters from 04 and 08 to 12, either by increasing the turnout or increasing the share, increasing their performance from 59 into the 60s?
Well, I'm kind of of mixed minds about this, actually. I mean, one thing we should mention, because I get left out a lot, is that Asian American vote is also growing quite a lot, and there were more immigrants from Asia last year than from Latin America.
Moved very much toward the Democrats.
And
further.
Also voted 75-25 for the Democrats. At the same time, our notion of kind of what race is, where it used to be that kind of if you were Italian, then you were considered many, many years ago, maybe kind of not exactly white, or even Irish, potentially. No, seriously. And Hispanic is a label where you go, I went to a wedding a couple of years ago in South Texas, right? And, it's all a mix. There's not a big distinction between Hispanic and white. And I think, as you see Hispanics become more and more integrated with younger generations into the U.S., then some of those racial distinctions might fall apart. Now, there's no doubt that if you're always counting on the voters who have the Reader's Digest problem, who are dying off, then you have to make a course correction sooner or later, and there are kind of short-term versus long-term issues. I think kind of if you have John McCain, or who I hope I'm not misquoting him, but say we have to pass immigration reform or we're screwed, and in 2016? No, they're not, right? If we're in a recession in 2016, then the Democrats going to have a very difficult time getting a third consecutive Democratic term, no matter what the Republican or the Democratic strategy might be. But they do have to fix this problem by 2020, 2024, or then the math becomes more insurmountable.
So there's the flip side, though. So much of the Clinton era was about restoring the Democrats' ability to compete for those working class white voters. I mean, that at a time when they were a majority of the electorate. We've now had two elections where, according to the exit polls, the 2010 election, Republicans won 60% of white voters. 2012, as I said, Mitt Romney won 59. In a presidential year, President Obama was able to overcome that. But can the Democrats sustain any kind of stable political advantage, particularly in Congress, if they can't do better than 37, 38, 39% among white voters? Do they have a problem on that front as well, or can they kind of survive those kind of margins?
Well, as you know, Ron, you've written a lot about, I think, the new professional voter. And I do believe that the new professional voter is an important new constituency. That if you look at it, I think that less than 5% of the voters will not have graduated high school. It's a dramatically more educated electorate. It's an electorate, despite the fact that the Electoral College drives so much talk about manufacturing jobs, it's an electorate that's really dominated by service sector jobs and new jobs in technical and other fields. So there are a lot of new constituencies being created. I think the new professional voter is one that Democrats can do extremely well in and can be, I think, kind of a second arch, of an expansion strategy.
I would think that's one of the challenges in this vision of increasing your performance among whites for Republicans. When Reagan was elected, the electorate was 62% non-college white, 27% college white, 11% minority. By 2012, it was 36, 28. And as Mark is saying, the college-educated white, although Obama didn't do great there, only got 42%, it was significantly better than the blue collar. So even the white electorate seems to be evolving demographically in a way that is somewhat more favorable for Democrats.
One demographic that's not talked about as much is the non-religious or secular vote. Right. If you kind of run a big old logistic regression model and you say, I have my exit polls, I have tens of thousands of observations, I have a good robust sample size, kind of what predicts voting behavior the best in presidential elections, then first of all, being African American is by far the best predictor, at least when Obama's on the ballot. But very high up there is, are you someone who's non-Christian? By which I mean, Jewish or Buddhist or Muslim but more often just people who are either actively describe themselves as atheists or more often just say, no, religion's not really kind of something that registers in my daily life as much. And that's a very, very strongly liberal voting group, and we're becoming a less religious nation, and that's changing things a bit.
Along that point, a few years ago, I asked a leading Republican micro-targeting person the same question I asked you. What one thing would you want to know about a person? And they said the single most revealing thing they could find out was the presence of a Bible in the home, as their best predictor.
If you had to have three things, I'd say kind of race, religion, and region, really, or kind of where they live. If you know those three things, right, it's not always easy to infer those three things unless you actually go out and talk to the person, but those three things will tell you really most of what you need to know.
We're going to bring you guys in a second. I want to ask you one last thing, though, because thinking about the Clinton era and talking about this, as we were saying, when Bill, a lot of the Clinton agenda, and I certainly covered those campaigns, was about finding ways to restore, I believe, make the Democrats acceptable again to a lot of these working class white voters who had moved away from them in the Reagan and Bush years. And he kept looking for ways on issues like welfare, crime, abortion, safe, legal, and rare, to bridge kind of the more liberal beliefs of the Democratic Party with what he thought were more culturally conservative voters that were moving away. President Obama has had a more consistently culturally liberal agenda. Certainly the biggest difference on gay marriage from DOMA. He accepted the fight on contraception. They just finished the thing today, even with a big battle with the Catholic Church, Planned Parenthood, gun control, other immigration. Is it more plausible now, given the changing nature of the Democratic coalition, the greater reliance on these professional voters, to be more consistently liberal, especially on social issues, than it was for Clinton?
Well, but you're defining, I think, social issues. I think certainly the entire country has moved on social issues, so that Obama is in the mainstream when he wanted to now declare the DOMA unconstitutional. He was in the mainstream really about immigration reform, 60 to 75%. Interestingly, Obama then is a national security conservative, right? So if you look for where the issue that he's taken over to the other side, whether it was the Afghanistan surge or whether it's the drone strikes or whether his belief that the government needs the information that it needs, he has taken some what would be arguably more conservative views.
But on the
that
social
mix
side,
things
you
up.
think
On the social side, there's no question that the country has moved in that direction. That's the biggest deficit that the Republican Party has, which is most correlated to religion. One other point I'll just make about the biggest demographic surprise, I think, for the country is that everything has been predicated on the country getting older, meaning the electorate would get older, meaning we'd have too many retirees and a social security crisis. And lo and behold, a tremendous amount of immigration has come in that is younger. Right. And not only has work actually expanded so that people don't retire as frequently from a lot of jobs as early as they do, but the truth is, this is the first time the electorate did not get as old as you might have predicted that it would get.
And throwing in a small editorial before we bring you in, that I think is one of the biggest challenges we're going to face in years ahead. We have a growing senior population that is 80% white, because we essentially had no immigration between 1924 and 1965. The baby boom is white. We have a youth population that will be majority non-white in this decade, not in the 2030s or 40s, and are moving in very different directions in what they want out of government and society. I mean, I've called this the brown and the gray, and it is really unclear exactly how we resolve the tension. Because certainly you look at this election, 60% of white seniors, 60% of whites over 45 voted for Romney. And what must have been like 75% of minorities, 85% probably minorities under 30, voted for Obama. And how we reconcile that is not all clear. Go ahead.
Well, no, I mean, one thing that in the short term really would be very, very damaging to the Republican Party is if it became as easy to vote as it is to, I can now from my phone go and transfer $5,000 from my checking account to my savings account, right? But you can't vote from your phone yet. If you made it really easy for people to vote, then that would be very harmful to the GOP. One thing about, you talk about kind of a grand bargain. This is kind of maybe reveals too much about my own kind of libertarianish views, right? But why not say, okay, you can kind of run as many ads as you want and loosen campaign finance laws, but the trade-off is that you also loosen the laws to voting. So say spend as much money as you want. It has to be true, right? But then, make it easy for people to vote however they want, online or in person, 2 weeks in advance, or on election day by mail. Just make it really easy to register and vote at the same day. That's an outmoded idea that you have to register weeks in advance, right? That would be an interesting compromise. I think that would be kind of freedom enhancing, and how it would play out would be interesting.
I'm going to come back at the end for a lightning round, but let's bring in the audience. It's a little hard to see you. There are microphones. There's one microphone over here, so just raise your hand, and we apologize we can't see you in the lights. I think the first one is, there we go. Oh, thank you. First one back there in the middle, if you could. And then we'll have, I think over there first, then you second. Go ahead, sir.
So the House between now and 2020 and the House after the 2020 census, projections and predictions.
Democratic odds of retaking the House?
1 in 10, probably not more than that. So this is a case, you kind of alluded to this before, but the fact that you do have Republicans are still doing pretty well among white voters and kind of exurban voters, whereas you have Democrats are packed in cities. That happens to work perfectly fine for Democrats at the state level. Things get mixed up enough, but in congressional districts you have kind of a geographic skew. People think it's all due to gerrymandering, but a lot of it's just that in New York City, 85% of people in my neighborhood now vote, or more than that, probably 92% vote Democrat, right? That takes away Democratic swing voters from other parts of the country. So you could see kind of a long-term play where the Democrats would win the White House more than half the time, and the Republicans would win the House well more than half the time.
One other angle that underscores Nate's point, Obama won a pretty solid popular vote victory, 5 million votes. He won 700 of the 3,100 counties in America. And it basically underscores the Democratic vote is concentrated in a way that makes it hard for them in the House competition, and the difficulty is compounded by redistricting, but I agree with you, not fundamentally created by it. Mitt Romney despite what we just said, won more House districts than President Obama. So it could be challenging. The House Republicans are largely segregated, is a good word, from the demographic changes that are making it so hard for them to win the White House. 80% of them are in districts that are more white than the national average.
Right. The one trend I'll make about 2020 is that if you look at what's happened to rural America is being depopulated, dramatically so, into either ex-urban or suburban areas. And that, in the long term, means that those districts will be fewer and will have less voting strength, and there will be more essentially suburban districts cropping up, which is a different political dynamic at the end of the day.
There was someone over there, yes.
So, if I might, I'd like to go back to my name's Eric Isaacs. I'm director of Argonne National Labs in Chicago. Getting back to the more fundamental question around the science of prediction. And in particular, take a complex system like the voting system and electing officials. You can't predict the future, right? I mean, you can only do it with some amount of certainty, but not perfect certainty. Any election could be derailed by terrorist attack, by an economic crash. And as you go further back in time away from the election day, of course, that uncertainty gets bigger and bigger. So could you comment a little bit in both of your models when you think about how you model the future, how you incorporate and quantify uncertainty? Because in many ways, that's the most important thing. If you're advising an important guy who becomes president, you don't want to screw it up. So can you say a little bit about how you incorporate into the way you think about prediction this idea of quantifying uncertainty?
Well, I'll give you the experience of one of the first polls I ever took. I'm going through the first poll, and we're doing a presidential poll in New York State, and I say, stop the poll, stop the poll. And my then partner, Doug Schoen, turns around and says, why do we have to stop the poll? I said, you've left out one of the candidates. And I said, he said, who'd we leave out? I said, Jimmy Carter, we left him out. He said, nah, forget about it. He's not getting anything. So now the truth is, had we at that poll, he would have gotten 1%. So he was right and he was wrong, right? And that is politics. These polls and even our predictions are a snapshot in time. Being president is a low probability profession, right? It starts out with a pretty extensive field, and if you get to do it, there are that many things that either come into play or derail. You try to come up with as many contingencies as you can, but remember, a campaign is going to be somewhere between 6 months and 2 years, right? And that's the time period that one really has to plan for in a campaign. And then you will have, the biggest, again, using some of the older ones about, I was reading Nate's columns about upsets. And the biggest upset, an unpredicted upset, was actually Frank Lautenberg's first election. He was 29 points a month out, and his theme was jobs, 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 which no one cared about until the beginning of the month. A jobs report came out, and he had the right message at the right time. And politics actually is oftentimes a matter of the right message, the right time, and staying in the game until the political cycle comes around to you.
Yeah, let me.
Yeah.
I mean, every prediction that we put out is framed in terms of probabilities, and I call it. There are different semantics, but I prefer to call them forecasts instead of predictions. There are weird cases where you might say, for example, that I think this candidate. The convention wisdom says candidate has only a 5% chance. I think he has a 20% chance, right? Maybe I'd say, Rand Paul, I don't know if this is true, but, the conventional wisdom, he had a betting line in Vegas might say he's a 20-1 long shot, and I'd say, take that bet. He probably won't win the GOP nomination, but at 20-1, you make a theoretical profit over the long term. That's really hard to...
Do you bet on the elections?
I don't bet. I first of all, I'd say I have a lot of interest in getting the outcome right. I'm someone where my incentives are pretty well aligned, where we do kind of make predictions or put our necks out there. And so there's a lot. I got scolded by the New York Times for offering to bet Joe Scarborough $1,000 for charity, right? And it's like, no, my future income stream had way more than $1,000 resting on the line, and maybe for real, because in theory you're supposed to get, if you make a lot of 70% bets, or I guess you're up to 90% for Obama by election day itself, right? But you're still going to get one of those 10 wrong. We had Heidi Heitkamp, the Democratic Senate candidate in North Dakota. We gave her only a 9 or 10% chance of winning, about the same as we gave for Mitt Romney, and she won, right? If that were the race people have been focusing on, then it would be different right now.
Do companies and governments try to respond to the issue raising that question through scenarios? I mean, having often you'll see projections, a series of projections. And trying to have kind of a middle projection, like the EPA will do that, for example, in impact of a regulation.
Yeah, it's hard to sometimes know. I mean, you need a basis for which you create those confidence intervals, right? And that's a tricky problem. It's a lot trickier in some ways. So one thing I spend a lot of time focusing on is kind of when are things more or less predictable. Obviously, one case is that earlier in the campaign, much more difficult to predict than later in the campaign. But there are more subtle things too. I think kind of Mark alluded to earlier when the polls disagree, right? When you have some polls showing, if you have every poll showing a candidate 5 points ahead, pretty predictable, right? If you have some polls showing a dead heat and some polls showing a candidate 10 polls ahead, they might average to 5, but a lot more chance the underdog wins in that case. That's a difficult election to know.
One down here and then one over there. Do we have the mic? Can we come down this? Yeah, we go. Thank you.
Yes. What implications do you think, if any, from the Supreme Court decision this week on the Voting Rights Act, because you mentioned redistricting, and I'm from the South, and that's a huge issue that could impact, I think, the next presidential election?
Well, look, the Supreme Court decided that it saw a different America, and in the America it saw, African American turnout had exceeded white turnout in the last election, and there was a dramatic movement towards social tolerance that now raised to constitutional status. So, in some ways, it's quite interesting how their look into America. Now, the question you raise is, what happens when the Supreme Court makes a ruling that might be consistent with the new in America, but rather old-fashioned politicians get into the act, right, and then do what they can because they're freed of additional supervision. That's going to be up to the media to expose, and I do think this is a story, there will be, just as when I think laws and attitudes change towards finance and politics, we're going to have to see what happens here, because there is an imperative here that you guys raised for Republicans maybe to keep turnout a little lower. And so they're going to try to reflect that imperative in what they do. And in politics, everybody walks up to the line until they're walked back from the line.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a question about, well, if you have the Voting Rights Act in place, a different provision than the one was struck, but require sometimes a creation of majority-minority districts. Am I screwing that up? Yeah. I'm not sure that those are all that helpful to Democrats, really, where you can have this problem where you have Democrats districts that vote for Obama by 60 points, and then they lose the median district by 2. At the same time, again, most that's because of geography and not because of gerrymandering or the Voting Rights Act, for better or for worse. But yeah, I think the more important question is, are you erecting more barriers to voting, right? I think Republicans aren't that concerned about whether black people in particular vote. They don't want Democrats to vote, though. Whether being black right now is a pretty good predictor of being Democratic, but you can also make it harder for younger people to vote, for example. It surprises me that typically when a party gets in power, then it has kind of a long-term interest in changing how the game is played going forward. So if the Democrats are being really kind of long-term strategic, then when they controlled everything in 2009, 2010, then you probably would have wanted to pass more laws, although voting at the state level more than the national level, the legislation that governs it, but to guarantee broader rights to vote.
I agree that the issue is more the voter ID than the redistricting. And for the Republicans, it is unquestionably a Faustian bargain, because on the one hand, they are trying to sand down, I believe that many of them are hoping to sand down that minority participation by just enough, but it also reinforces the kind of image problems they have in many of those communities. And we saw in a place like Florida, where it seemed like people were awfully determined to confound the desire to keep them home. So over here.
This is a great discussion. Andy Revkin, I wonder if you could just quickly poke out of the realm of politics and talk about Nate about climate modeling. One of the most interesting things I ever heard from a computer modeler was 2002. Suki Manabe, one of the founders of this whole field, said too often his colleagues mix up qualitative realism with quantitative realism. In other words, it behaves like the world, therefore it is like the world, and we can use it. So that, and actually, it's a complex system that doesn't actually, a lot of the modeling has not borne out. The other area is the NSA. Talk about big data and big computers. If you could just really give your sense of what you feel about how that's been playing out, that'd be really cool.
Well, climate, so in my book I have kind of a 13,000 word chapter on climate science and climate prediction, and I feel like it's a subject that kind of needs those full 13,000 words to get out my argument, which is a really kind of fussy
That'd be an
argument.
excellent conversation at the book signing.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think the point Mark made before about, do you understand what's going on in the present versus predicting the future? I think on the climate we understand pretty darn well what's happening in the present. We understand why the Earth has gotten warmer. We understand it's because of the greenhouse effect. It's a pretty basic chemical equation. To be exact about the level of warming or more specific types of weather events, especially as you go further out in time, there is a fair amount of uncertainty there. I think there's more uncertainty than maybe people would want to let on. I think it's also symmetrical, so it can be both upside and downside risk. But if you look at the first IPCC projections in 1990, they were a little high, right? At the same time, in this kind of context of well, a lot of 20-year or 30-year out predictions aren't very good. The fact that they're sort of getting the gist of it more or less right is if you expect perfection is not great, but relative to a lot of other things is okay, right? But I think part of the issues you've had a lot of climate scientists who have maybe making a good faith effort to make people take action in the near term when it is a relatively weak signal and a long-term phenomenon, really, enough that you can have 10 years where you don't have warming, right? And that's not all that unlikely, but it also means that you're moving things at a very low rate, and that it's not going to necessarily show up in ways that are obvious. And sometimes people are too quick to attribute kind of random weather events to climate change. So it's a tricky issue.
Mark, can I ask you about the other half of it, and just throw, if I could amend the other part, which is polling we recently did. People have a lot of anxiety not only about what the government may know about them, but what the kind of the whole online world, all of the information that is being accumulated by them, sometimes without their consent. How do you assess kind of people's acceptance of this new world where they seems to be very difficult to kind of hold what you want in your own control?
Well, first, before I move
Yeah.
to the second one, I'm just going to tell an amusing story because, like a lot of people here, I took the plane from Denver to Aspen, right? So I really always
true
find
joy.
it. I always find it one of the most harrowing fights in America.
Yes.
So the plane took off on time. Now, the plane doesn't take off on time unless they believe that Aspen's clear. So it's only a 30-minute flight. 15 minutes into the flight, they announced that we're going to circle for a half hour, which we do, which meant that they could not predict the half hour of climate from here to Aspen, or we would not have taken off.
I would say, though, weather forecasting is an area which has gotten a lot better, right? And there are kind of all these axioms about, well, something becomes too complex, it's hard to predict, but weather forecasting is dramatically better than it was 25 years ago.
Talk about the other half.
And
look,
privacy. I think the other half is that, privacy is an important issue for people. And I think that the whole debate is the question is, so where are the boundaries and where are the limits, right? Some of what, and therefore, there's all the information that as you go around that could be known and could be monetized and could be used for various purposes. And then the question is, what's appropriate? So what's justified for national security purposes? What's justified for monetizing purposes? Where are those limits? I think we're going to have over time here a fair and reasonable debate about exactly where those limits are. And those limits are different by purpose.
All right, we are essentially out of time. We've been talking about predictions. I will be run out of the room if I do not ask you for one specific prediction. And if you can answer or not. Do you think Hillary Clinton will run for president in 2016? And wait, and if you don't want to answer that, If you don't answer that, at least give me a sense of what you think the considerations pro and con will be.
You know, I won't give you a prediction on that.
figured that.
I always thought she'd be a great president. I still think she would be a great president at any time, you know, including the next election. And I think that, as I said, it's a decision that she's going to have to make. But I think she earned a tremendous amount of respect as Secretary of State, and there's no question, you know, that she has the kind of experience.
What are the factors that would encourage her to run or discourage her from running?
Well, I think that you can read any. I'd rather read Nate Silver's column and see when he reduces it. I'd like to hear actually.
Yes, I know. We're
Nate
going there.
Silver's
Don't steal my question.
percentage prediction to
yes.
this.
So,
but I'm going to say this is one prediction I'm not going to make, other than that she would be a great president every day.
handicap Hillary Rodham Clinton as both a primary and general election candidate in 2016.
Well, I think any Democrat would be pretty insane to run against her if she does run. There's really never, and let's look at the case of, you know, say Obama running for re-election last year, right? I mean, she has incumbents type numbers in terms of her favorability ratings and her ballot preference with Democrats right now. I mean, will she run? Look, she shifted from saying, oh, no, never, what a terrible idea, to, oh, I have to think about it, right? You know, I mean, half the time when people say, oh, what a terrible idea, they will end up running anyways. So, you know, I'd say right now she's doing things that are consistent with what a presidential candidate would do if they wanted to run. I think if she had any type of health issue, or if she felt like the general election race was difficult to win. You know, for better or worse, the open seat races are a little bit less predictable, but she's going to inherit some of Obama's baggage or some of his coattails if he's a popular president in 2016.
One number I would put out there to remember if she does run is that, as you know, President Obama in 2012 won only 42% of white women, 38% of non-college white women, 46% of college white women, down with both from 2012. And the challenge for Republicans who are hoping to maybe increase their overall share of the white vote is it's hard to see if Hillary Clinton is the nominee that she would not have a chance of doing better than only 42% among white women.
Well, and
There's room to
the
grow.
prediction is either in 2016 or not in the distant future beyond that, we will have a woman president.
Yeah, there you go. All right. On that predictive note, join me in thanking Mark Penn and Nate Silver for a great conversation. Yeah, that was great.